As David shared, I'm Mark Phillips. Me and my wife are missionaries. Our family is missionaries to Madagascar. We serve with International Mission Board. If you're not sure what that is, that's okay. We're the mission sending arm of Southern Baptist churches, and if you give to Lottie Moon or give to the cooperative program, then which I'm assuming you guys do to some degree, then you support us already. And really what we want to do this morning is say thank you and just share about what God's doing. And so thank you. And thank you, Caleb and David, for having us this morning and letting us share. My wife, there you are, you moved. I was like, is Amy. We have 4 kids, Grace, Oliver, Naomi, and Evangelia, who are 11, 8, 6, and 4. And they keep us on our, where's it at? There it is. Technology is against me today. They keep us on our toes, keep us going as we go. Real quick, Madagascar is in Africa, in case you didn't know that. It's not just a movie, it's a real place. And a lot of people live there. And we share the gospel with them. And that's who we are and what we do. Before we dive into more stuff, I want to spend some time in the Word, maybe 5-10 minutes. And then my wife Amy will join us, and we're going to share a little bit more of the nuts and bolts. And maybe if there's time, do a question or something. So let's start in 2 Kings chapter 7. I want to give you, you're probably thinking the missionary is supposed to preach from Matthew chapter 28. You know, that's the thing. But I'm not going to do that. We're going to start in 2 Kings chapter 7. We're going to do verses 3 through 16. But I'll give you the context. The Syrians have besieged Samaria. And they have closed off the city. The Samaritans are closed in their city. They can't get in or out. The army is outside the walls. The Syrians are preparing to attack. And it's bad. People are starving. There's no food. There's a famine. They're besieged. They can't get anything from the outside. And they're starving. They're eating strange things. You can read about this in chapter 6 and part of chapter 7. They've even resorted to cannibalism. It's really, really, really bad. There are 4 guys who are lepers. If it wasn't bad enough that everybody in town is starving and even resulted to cannibalism, it's so bad. These 4 guys are lepers, and they're outside the gate, and they're not even allowed in the city. So they're kind of like, if you can imagine in your mind's eye, as I do, that they're like up against the wall because the army's right there, and they're not allowed in the city because they're lepers, and they're starving, everybody's starving, and they're like, we're going to die. So let's pick it up in verse 3. Sorry, 2 Kings chapter 7. 2 Kings chapter 7, I'll begin in verse 3. Now there were 4 men who were lepers at the entrance to the gate, and they said to one another, why are we sitting here until we die? If we say, let us enter the city, the famine is in the city, and we shall die there. And if we sit here, we die also. So now come, let us go over to the camp of the Syrians. If they spare our lives, we shall live. If they kill us, we shall but die. So they arose at twilight to go to the camp of the Syrians. But when they came to the edge of the camp of the Syrians, behold, there was no one there, for the Lord had made the army of the Syrians hear the sound of chariots and of horses, the sound of a great army, so that they said to one another, behold, the king of Israel has hired against us the kings of the Hittites and the kings of Egypt to come against us. So they fled away in the twilight and abandoned their tents, their horses, and their donkeys, leaving the camp as it was, and fled for their lives. And when these lepers came to the edge of the camp, they went into a tent and ate and drank, and they carried off silver and gold and clothing and went and hid them. Then they came back and entered another tent and carried off things from it and went and hid them. Then they said to one another, we are not doing right. This day is a day of good news. If we are silent and wait until the morning light, punishment will overtake us. Now therefore come, let us go and tell the king's household. So they came and called to the gatekeepers of the city and told them, we came to the camp of the Syrians, and behold, there was no one to be seen or heard there, nothing but horses tied and the donkeys tied and the tents as they were. And then the gatekeepers called out, and it was told within the king's household. And the king rose in the night and said to his servants, I will tell you what the Syrians have done to us. They know that we are hungry. Therefore, they have gone out of the camp to hide themselves in the open country, thinking, when they come out of the city, we shall take them alive and get into the city. And one of his servants said, let us take 5 of the remaining horses. Let some men take 5 of the remaining horses, seeing that those who are left here will fare like the whole multitude of Israel who have already perished. Let us send and see. So they took 2 horsemen, and the king sent them after the army of the Syrians, saying, go and see. And so they went after them as far as the Jordan, and behold, all the way was littered with garments and equipment that the Syrians had thrown away in their haste. And the messengers returned and told the king. Then the people went out and plundered the camp of the Syrians. So a seah of fine flour was sold for a shekel, and 2 seahs of barley for a shekel, according to the word of the Lord. Now there's a whole lot of context we can talk about, but I want to really just focus on the specific part of this story and these 4 lepers. And you may still be wondering why the missionary is talking about this. If you think about this story, there's 4 lepers who have nothing. They're abandoned by their society, left out with nothing. They're literally falling apart. They're starving to death. They're the bottom of the barrel. They have no hope. They're at the point where they're like, if we go in the city, first of all, they probably won't let us in there. Everybody's dying in there anyway. If we stay here, we're going to die. Let's go over to the enemy army. Maybe they'll capture us and feed us something, and maybe we'll survive. But if not, at least maybe they'll put us out of our misery and we'll be dead. It's really bad. And these guys are having the worst of the worst. So in a moment of abandon, in a moment of surrender, in a moment of desperation, they give up and they go to the Syrian army, but they don't know that God has already provided a way. God has already provided salvation before they even went. And he made the Syrian army hear armies. The Hittites from the north, the Egyptians from the south. The Syrians think, oh, we're surrounded, we're going to be killed. And they just leave as fast as they can. They head for the Jordan River. About 20 miles away is how far the king's men followed to check up on this. No trace of them. Just their clothes and weapons and things that they left as they ran away in fear. And these lepers, they come into the Syrian camp thinking we're either about to be captured, which is their best hope. We're about to become prisoners in the enemy camp. That's my biggest hope. That's what they were thinking. Or we're about to be killed. That's my number 2 hope. And they come in, and God has provided salvation. They come in and realize that everything is provided. They eat. They plunder the tents. They eat until they're full. They fill their pockets. They take bags and they go away and they hide their treasure. They come back to another tent and they do the same thing. They fill themselves. They're overflowing with abundance. Everything was left. Gold and silver, food. They do this again. They take it away and hide another stash for themselves. They come back to do this again for a 3rd time, and they stop and they say to one another, and this is the point I want to get to this morning, verse 9. And they said to one another, we are not doing right. This day is a day of good news. And if we are silent and wait until the morning light, punishment will overtake us. Now, therefore, let us go and tell the king's household. It's not right for us to hold on to God's salvation for only ourselves. We can't take the abundance and salvation, the blessing that God has given us, and said we're just going to hoard it, and we're going to feast upon it, and we're going to feast upon it, and we're going to treasure it away, never sharing, knowing that just over there are those that are starving and dying because they have no idea that salvation is just waiting. That salvation has already been provided, because that's what was happening in the walls of the city. While the lepers who had nothing were feasting and filling their pockets, and in abundance, the people in the city were still dying. They were still starving. They had no idea that God's provision, God's salvation had already come and was provided. And they said, today is the day of good news. Today is the day of God's salvation, and it would be wrong if we don't go and tell. So the lepers went back, and they said, God has provided a way. No one's in the enemy camp. And of course, like all of us would, we were suspicious. We checked. We sent out our spies to look, which is what most people do when they first hear the gospel. They're like, not sure about this. But then they found out it was real. And they came flooding out of the city. And what we didn't read about was a faithless man who doubted God's prophet died because of the stampede of people coming out of the city. And they were saved. They were rescued from starvation because of God's provision. And this is why we have Matthew 28. This is why we have Revelation 7:9, that when God calls us to go and make disciples of all nations, it's because he's given us abundance as believers. He's given us spiritual blessing. He's given us salvation. He's given us adoption as his children, that we're no longer like the spiritual lepers who have nothing, who are spiritually bankrupt, spiritually broken, spiritually purely sinners. But he has given us son and daughtership with him. He's given us his family. He's given us his son. He saved us. And now we must go. We must share what God has given. And so that's why we go and why the church goes to share the gospel with those who don't know that God's provided. This is the call that one day we hope to see all those from all peoples, like in Revelation 7:9, people from every tribe, tongue, people, language, around the throne, worshiping and serving our God. So, I could keep going, but I'm going to dial it back because we got other things we're going to share this morning. Amy's going to join me. We're going to spend a little bit of time talking about a few other things. So we want to, as we talk about what it means to go and what that is, when we say we want to go and we want to share, we want to kind of fill in that idea to talk about, when we say we're missionaries, that has ideas that a lot of people think about. When we say we're missionaries with the IMB, yeah, let's do that. Hello? Is that better? Okay, great. When we're missionaries with the IMB, what is the IMB? Who's the International Mission Board? And when you say Madagascar, what is that? Who are they? So we want to kind of fill those things in to give all this picture a little bit more fullness. So Amy's going to share a little bit.
Thank y'all for receiving us this morning. And I know that we're strangers to most of you, but we do very much appreciate all the support that you give us through the cooperative program. We could not do what we do without your giving and your partnership with us. Even though you don't know me by name until this moment, you are a part of our work, and we do very much appreciate that. So here's just some pictures that we chose just from our life, and they'll just play in the background. But Madagascar is an island off the coast of Africa. When the Lord called Mark and I to go to Madagascar, I didn't even know where it was. All I knew was the cartoon, and I was like, is that even a real place? I didn't even know that was a real place. So I thought it was off of South America, but it's not. It's off of Africa. And they are a very kind and loving people, and their whole culture there is very slow-paced. And so as Americans, efficient Americans, where efficiency seems to reign over every single thing we do, and it's lovely, efficiency is irrelevant in Madagascar, and things just go with the flow. And so, yeah, that's a little bit about them. There are 18 different people groups. Do you mind to pull up that map? A people group is just a group of people defined differently than another group of people for some reason. Culture, language. And so for Madagascar, there's 18 different people groups. And for Madagascar, each people group speaks their own dialect of the language. The language is called Malagasy. And so Mark and I have both been to Africa. I've been to Kenya, and he's been to Kenya and Uganda. And Madagascar is not anything like the Africa, and we've been to South Africa that we've been to. Madagascar is mostly populated by islands like in the ocean to the east of Madagascar. And so it's much more Polynesian than African when you get there and see. And the language doesn't sound African. And we work and live on the east side of the island. There, we live in a rainforest. Yes, it's humid, and yes, it rains a lot. God gives us grace to live there. And with lovely people, and they're the Betsimi Sadaka. And I think that's all I wanted to say about that. One of the things that really defines a lot of what we do or affects it is the poverty in Madagascar. It's the 4th poorest nation in the world. Like, once you're that poor, I don't know how you can, like, rate it. They're really poor. Like, I don't know how they decide, who decides that on a statistic. But despite that, we find that most people are genuinely interested in the gospel and learning more about Christ. And their religion is animism, which is believing that spirituality is all around you in things, and they specifically pray to their dead ancestors. And there's a lot of evil, weird, and gross things that they do in their culture and in their worship. And Christ is more powerful than that and can break the bonds of that, and he has in Madagascar. But that is something that we deal with, and that's a little snippet about where we live and our people.
So, like I shared before, we're with the IMB, and that means we're sent by you, really. And we have a home sending church, which is First Baptist Church in McAllen, Texas. We're originally from Muskogee area. I was born and raised there, and we served on staff at First McAllen for a time, and the Lord called us to a mission field from there, and they're our home sending church. But we're also sent by Southern Baptists as a whole. And that happens through mission giving, through the Lottie Moon Christmas offering. And there's things in these pictures as we go that, because of those who give, make all these things possible. That's perfect timing. That's what we call our Lottie truck. So that's a vehicle that's provided by the International Mission Board, and it allows us to do a lot of the work that we do. If it wasn't for that vehicle, getting around Madagascar would be extremely difficult. Madagascar is, it's rough. I'm trying to think of a word that encapsulates it. It's a rough place. The roads are rough. I think the last time I heard the statistic was like 4% of the roads in Madagascar are paved, and the rest of them are, well, see if I can find that. There's a short, tiny little video here that will give you an idea of the roads there. Well, it's not cool. Yeah, let's do that. Sorry. this video. It's really short, but it'll give you an idea of the roads in Madagascar. This is a road to a village about 45 kilometers north of where we live. It's Vuitumburu, and you drive quite a ways on the pavement, then you get off the pavement, and this is the road. If it has recently rained, you do not drive. Yeah, trust me, I tried. So let me throw this back up there real quick. But because of that vehicle and because of the giving, it allows us to get into places. Just in August, we went to a very remote village, and it took us a long time. We got to the end of what they call the good road, which no one in America would call that a road. We got to the bad road, and within the course of about 20, 30 minutes, I was stuck to my axles twice. We dug out twice, and I decided it's easier to walk than drive. So we parked the car, and we walked the next 7 miles through mud to the village that we were going to share the gospel, to encourage a local church that we had discovered was there, and see if we could partner with them. And all this is part of the giving and how we do our work and how giving helps that. Yeah. We could dig in more, but we're going to slow down. And do we want to do any questions?
I'll do like this. That worked. I appreciate you guys being here. And one of the things I kind of wanted to do was see if we could tie this to the celebration of Christ being born a little bit. And later on, when you're at home with your families, I encourage you to read Matthew, the 1st chapter, and see about Joseph coming to the realization that his life was changing. Right? Like, so if you imagine where Joseph and Mary live, there's only about 400 people. And I'm sure some of these towns that you go to, the population is very small. And so you're going to know everybody in that village. And you can imagine Joseph knowing Mary. If there's only 400 people in the town, you get rid of the adults, there's maybe 100 kids. And so Mary and Joseph likely grew up knowing each other, and their families knew each other, and that's why their marriage was arranged. And then all of a sudden, Joseph begins to think that maybe this whole life that he had planned wasn't going to work out when he discovers that Mary's pregnant. Right? Like, so when you're young and you're making plans for the future of your life, all of a sudden God shows up and just interrupts all your plans. And as missionaries, I'm sure that's something that happens all the time. You think you're going to this village, and then all of a sudden God redirects you, and the daily life, right? That this kind of structure that we're used to in the U.S., this movement of, okay, our 5-year, 10-year, 20-year plan, and we just want to make it to 65 or whatever age so that we can retire, and then we've got the boat and the RV in mind, and we just want to settle down. But when I read in Scripture, when God moves, He's constantly changing plans. And even once Joseph figures out that Mary is pregnant, he starts another plan. He's like, okay, I'm going to quietly, essentially what is divorce her, right? So he begins to, without trying to embarrass her, he's going to try to divorce her. And then God shows up, and he had just made this plan of how to get out of the situation, and God changes his plans again. And this is the way we read about how the Holy Spirit works. It's like this wind that blows you this way and that way, and you're not exactly sure how it's going. So what I would be really interested to hear about is, you come from kind of this area. How did God blow you there? And how did you know that this is what God was calling you to do? Because some of us look for like 100% certainty. Were you like totally, this is it? Or was God just kind of weaving and blowing you that direction?
That's a big question. No, it's good. It's a good question. Amy felt called to missions when she was 10. I got saved when I was 11, didn't come from a believing home, and didn't really honestly have any clue, like a legitimate idea of what it meant to be a missionary or who that was or what that was growing up, or even after I was a believer. And when I was in my early 20s, I had an opportunity to go on a short-term mission project, and the Lord had been speaking to my heart about missions, and I was thinking, okay, maybe this is something God wants for me. And I spent some time overseas where God really cemented in my heart. But it came from the Word, as I read the Word and saw, and if you look for it, you don't have to look hard. It's all the way from Genesis to Revelations. It's in the stories, it's in the Scripture, time and time and time again, that God's heart is for the nations, that God has a desire to reach not just people, but all peoples. And his heart is to see that Revelation 7:9, where there are people from every tribe, tongue, and nation. And that began to burn in my heart. It began to be a part of who I was. And as I went and did this short-term project, the Lord just cemented in my heart, this is what you're to do. This is your life. And so I began exploring after that experience how to do that, what to do. We spent some time after we were married as short-term missionaries. We spent 1 year down near Mumbai in India. A couple years later, we went back and spent 2 years in Delhi, and then we came back and realized, we need to set our faces towards this for a career, for our lives. And so we came back, got some education stuff done, set our things in order, and we began looking towards going back with the idea that we would go towards India. And God had a very different idea. It was not India, and we never thought about Madagascar. And honestly, probably like many of you, had no idea anything about Madagascar other than the movie. It's like, oh, that's a cute movie, and that's it. You want to share something?
Yeah. So when we went back after New Delhi, the desire to serve God internationally and just see all peoples come to faith had burned in my heart since I was 10. But you have to finish school. As a 10-year-old, you can't just move overseas. And then I went to college, and then I met Mark. And my life had not gone the way I anticipated. And I wondered why on earth God told me when I was 10 that that's what he wanted me to do. And then years later, I still wasn't doing that, and it was very confusing. And finally, we were in New Delhi as missionaries, and I was very excited. In my mind, the path that God had me on were just stepping stones to finally get there. It was a very wrong perspective of how the Spirit works in your life. The journey and the path is the walk with the Lord, wherever he takes you and whatever you're doing. And when God called us to come back to the United States for Mark to kind of get some more education and seminary and be more prepared to move our family like forever overseas, I was very unhappy about that. I did not want to go back to the United States. And then we were going to be in Oklahoma. And then God called us to go on staff in Texas, like South Texas. Like Texas goes 4 hours south of San Antonio. Did y'all know that? Texas is so big. It was so far away from my friends and my family, and I was really angry about it. But then I loved the church, and I got settled in, and Mark was a youth minister, and I loved that, and we had 2 more kids, and it was great. And then one day, Mark comes home, and I was homeschooling Grace, and then we had 2 little ones in the house under her, and the hustle and bustle of getting everything ready for lunch. And Mark comes home, and he's got this real serious look on his face, and he leans to get the counter, and he's like, Amy, we need to talk. And I knew that face. That was the it's time to move face. And I just was like, I don't have time for this. My life is fine. I like it. I'm happy. This is where God must want us. And he was so patient, and over the next few weeks just said over and over, like, I really think that God might be moving us. I don't have answers. I can just feel that the Spirit's telling us it's time to move. And I just was like, okay, we'll pray about it. Sandwich anybody? And just really unsubmissive, like the heart of Jonah, to change. And I was doing the laundry, which is what all of us do, I guess. We all have chores that we have to do. And I was doing the laundry, and there was no, crazy, axe vision, the whole room changed color or anything. But as I was doing my laundry, I just prayed, God, can you help me want to follow you? Because I don't feel like I want to follow you. And my husband is saying something, and I can feel I'm against you, and I don't care, and I know that's wrong. Can you just help me care? And in that moment, I saw, like, in my mind, a picture of just people standing in flames, crying out, like all different people from all different nations. And I just heard God softly say to me, isn't it worth you considering that I might want you to move, like, for their souls? Real gentle and soft. And it just broke me. And we decided, and at that point I was pregnant with our fourth child, that if God wanted to move us, that he would have to tell both of us exactly where to go separately as confirmation. And like Gideon, we just asked God to do that for us. Would you please confirm that? And he did. To this place we didn't know where the island was, and to this specific name of the people group, which we couldn't even pronounce. God used a lot of different things just to confirm in our hearts that that was the place and that it was time.
I love, because it's so true and so honest that we often think, we romanticize missionaries sometimes, and we forget you're just regular people, and there's this resistance, and there's this fighting, and there's this tug, and there's this desire. And what I fear for a lot of people is that we have learned how to numb that fight and that tug and that desire when the Holy Spirit is trying to draw us, whether it's just to talk to somebody at work or whether we can shut that off and we can not listen to it. But sometimes you might be frustrated in your situation in your life right now. But Acts tells us that God has ordained the time and the boundaries and where and when we live. And sometimes our dissatisfaction from life comes because we're not fulfilling the purpose that God has designed for us. And that he could be using these circumstances if we would learn to worship in those things instead of complain. And what I hear you saying is that you were conflicted and struggling, but eventually what we're called to is obedience. And as you began to be obedient, God begins to then reveal. And it's not the big picture all at once. It was a little bit here, a little bit here, and a little bit here. If I'm correct, I believe about 80% of all International Mission Board missionaries are close to the age of retirement. That there is a huge gap that is about to appear if we do not raise up another generation of missionaries. And as you hear, you might go, man, I want to be a missionary, but I want to settle down and have my career and have kids. Some people are going to go, man, you have how many kids and you're in Madagascar? Aren't you worried about them? And there's all the fears that come in. What do you do with all the fears that come into your head when these big life-changing moments come up? How do you deal with those fears and trust that God is going to provide?
That's a good question. You got good questions. I'll put it real succinct because we don't always have the good answers, and I'll tell you, Caleb hits it on the head when we're just regular people. You know, people have this idea of this romanticized the real life missionary. You know, like ooh,
That's not us.
That's not us. I don't know if they exist, but if they do, it's not us. We're just regular people who are dumb enough to follow Jesus. And, you know, Peter, you read stories about Peter in the New Testament, and you're like, man, he was dumb. But you know what? He walked on water with Jesus. I want to be dumb enough to walk on water with Jesus. But that comes with it a lot of struggles, and we do. You know, we think about our family, my parents, our kids. There's a lot of it, and where do we put that? What do we deal with that? For me, maybe Amy has another answer to add to this, but for me, I know that the best place for my children, the best place for myself, the best place for us is in the will of Jesus. And if I know that I'm in his will, it doesn't get better. And when I look at the struggles that my family or my kids or myself were dealing with, I know that God didn't bring us into that situation to abandon us, that he is a better father than I am.
and he loves my kids more than I do, and he has more and better complete answers for how to deal with those things than I do. So the best thing for them is to just put myself in his will. And if that means jumping out of the boat and moving to Madagascar, I guess that's what we do.
The great adventure of Christianity isn't reserved for those who are adventurous. It's reserved for those who are just trusting. And it's incredible how we have made Christianity boring when God could use any one of you. Maybe it's not Madagascar. Maybe it's next door. But if we are trusting and faithful, and like Joseph, his plans get changed, they get changed, but he's just going to be obedient. All God asks for is for when he calls, we say, I don't get it, but okay. I don't get it, but okay. And then you begin to see that Christianity is the greatest adventure that you can take in this life. I want to, do you have anything else that you wanted to add to that?
Can I just share a story?
Sure.
Okay. I struggle with fear a lot, and it's something that I pray about a lot. My husband is incredibly steady, and I'm grateful that he anchors me often in my faith, because I have a lot of emotions, and fear comes with that at times. And we both got COVID last year, and the medical situation in Madagascar is pretty dire. If you could just think like a clinic in the middle of nowhere with just a few people that have like read some things on Google with I didn't mean that to be a joke, but I guess that is kind of funny. Yeah, that's the reality. And that's our reality. And before we went overseas, before we went to Madagascar, I prayed to the Lord, and mentally, I don't know if it seems silly, but in my mind and in my spirit, I set my children on this like Southern Baptist like altar like this, but it like was a table like that in my mind, and I set my children on that, and I said to God, I will trust you with them, whatever that means. And we've walked with our kids through some staph infections that were really scary, where Mark had to clean the wound and do the procedure and flush it. We're not trained medically.
Yeah, I'm not medically trained.
We can do Neosporin and Band-Aids really well, and the Lord was faithful in that, and he was faithful when Grace had dysentery, and she was okay. And when we got COVID, we decided to go to the Capitol because, well, there's children in here, so we realized with both of us having COVID, and we were both incredibly sick and weak, that we were alone, and that there was no one to take care of our children. And I was very afraid and thinking about the future. And our leadership said, you really need to go to the Capitol, where at least there's a missionary family, and you need to drive the 10 hours. And we were like, do you understand how sick we are? Like, I don't think we can drive. But they said, well, what's the alternative if the worst happens? And I was really afraid to be just raw. I was afraid that we were going to be on the road in the middle of the nowhere, and the worst was going to happen. My children would just be alone with nobody. And we just looked at each other and we said, we gave God our children. He's a better father than us. He didn't bring us out here to give us comfort. God is more interested in holiness than comfort. Maybe this is his will for us, but he's not going to abandon our children. It's going to be okay. And then in that moment, this very kind old lady that I didn't even knew how to work, she knew how to work FaceTime me, and I thought like it was a pocket call from our church in Texas, and I ignored it. And then she called back, and I was like, I guess this is for real. And she was just like, the Spirit had laid us on her heart all of a sudden, and she just tried to figure out FaceTime on her phone to call us, and just was like, I don't know what's going on. Are you guys okay? And it was in that moment where I was in the bedroom like struggling with what to do. And I just shared it with her, because it's kind of embarrassing to open up about your fears, because it sounds really unfaithful and untrusting in God. And God was good, and we're okay. And he brought us through. And maybe even if death was his plan for us, I really believe, and we believe, because he is trustworthy, not because I don't have fear, that he would have taken care of our children. So we try to just take our fears that we have every day and just put them at the feet of the Lord.